I want to invite to the stage Her Excellency, Miss Marie-Louise Colliera-Preca, who is the former President of Malta, who is also a UNIDO Goodwill Ambassador and a patron of Global Africa. And she's very relevant for this session because in her own country, she achieved full employment. After a long career in politics there, which started when she was 16 years old, she led the country to full employment. And as we talk about the issues and the challenges around employment in Africa, we'd love to hear from her. Please join us.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I wish to thank the European Commission and Boost Employability and Entrepreneurship Skills in Africa, BEES 55, for inviting me this year to this European Development Days. I'd also would like to acknowledge the tireless endeavors of my dear friend Marie Chantal, the Chief Executive of BEES 55, and her colleagues in endeavoring to realize tangible, empowering projects for the young people of Africa. It is truly a privilege to be present here with you to share our thoughts, our experiences, and our aspirations. And I would like to start my contribution by making a reference to a quote by the President of the European Commission, Mr. Jean-Claude Juncker, who during the African European Union Summit held in November 2017 said, "What happens in Africa matters for Europe, and what happens in Europe matters for Africa. Our partnership is an investment in our shared future. It is a partnership of equals in which we support each other, help each other to prosper, and make the world a safer, more stable, and more sustainable place to live." Education and employment are two pillars that are inherently linked to this inspiring vision. Education and employment define a person. In the broader sense, education and employment also define a community. The resulting opportunities brought about by education and employment, or the lack of these opportunities, have a profound impact on an individual's life and on that of their communities. Given their impact, education and employment not only rightly deserve our attention today, but also this discussion comes at a most appropriate time. Much has been said over many decades about Africa and its peoples. Much has been promised over many decades. However, the perspective of many of the international community, and unfortunately, even in Europe itself, have fallen short of the necessary impact. So much so, as although enrollment in primary education in developing countries has reached 91%, nonetheless, 57 million children are still without primary education. More than half of these children live in sub-Saharan Africa. This means that this is the region with the largest out-of-school children in the world. The ramifications of these indicators are significant. We all know the negative impact of lack of education. Education is the cornerstone in our lives, both as individuals and also as one human family. Evidence to the importance of education is definitely found in the targets set in the SDGs. Education, in fact, underpins the vast majority of these targets, which were agreed and are acknowledged by the international community. In 2015, nearly 5 years ago, the international community, through the United Nations, established Agenda 2030, the world's targets to be reached by 2030. However, we are still far from reaching these targets yet. Before the Sustainable Development Goals, we as an international community, we had agreed on the Millennium Development Goals. However, we have failed. We cannot continue to fail. We cannot continue to just speak. we cannot continue to be complacent. We need to pull up our socks and act in synergy effectively. Education is definitely key to solving some of humanity's most enduring problems. When people have access to education, they can overcome poverty. Education provides the tools and the know-how on leading more healthy and sustainable lives. Education reduces inequalities and accelerates the pace towards gender equality. Education also creates the necessary environments for tolerance, respect, and peace. Africa has the youngest population of any region in the world. It is therefore paramount to provide young people of Africa with access to education. Therefore, it is important to identify the barriers that have restrained access to millions of children and young people to quality education. The lack of adequately trained teachers, the poor conditions of schools, the lack of opportunities available to children with different abilities, and the difficult access to educational facilities, such as those children living in rural areas, all need to be examined in great detail. According to a study by the World Bank published last year, Africa faces a severe learning crisis that is undermining economic growth and the well-being of its citizens. The study argues that learning levels across the region are alarmingly low. Many children remain out of school, and those who attend are not acquiring the basic skills necessary for success later in their lives and in the lives of their communities. Creative strategies need to be devised. In this respect, we need to make reference to the Sustainable Development Goals and their related targets. The SDGs provide us with a pathway and with the direction on what needs to be done. Therefore, we actually do know what needs to be done. Our energies as an international community need to be focused on ensuring the provision of free, equitable, and quality education for all of our children, irrespective of who they are and where they come from. This is our responsibility as one human family. Proper early childhood development is necessary. Early childhood development prepares children for their educational development by giving them the necessary strong basic foundations. We know from research that lack of proper early childhood development puts such children in a disadvantage with their peers who come from a different background. Therefore, we need to ensure to put in place the right value chain, which must include proper early childhood development, equal access to education, and also the elimination of gender disparities. We need, as an international community, belonging to one human family, to make sure that these opportunities are available to all, including the most vulnerable and marginalized in our communities. We also need to ensure that persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, and children in vulnerable situations are at the heart of every step forward we must take. In practical terms, we need to strive harder for universal literacy and numeracy. Accessibility to quality education is the key solution to the empowerment of all of our children and young people, to educational, technical, and vocational training. Quality education is also key to the advancement of all of our children and young people to better their chances for entrepreneurship and employment. The study conducted by the World Bank, which I quoted earlier, proposed a series of priority areas that can boost educational opportunities in Africa. These are the provision of universal basic education with a focus on equitable access, quality and retention, ensuring effective management and support of teachers, increasing financing for quality education, and boosting institutional capacity. This necessary way forward needs the genuine will of the international community to provide the resources and support that can determine the progress towards an Africa where quality education is effectively available for all. Young Africans, like all other young people in the world, have all the potential to transform their country, but they need the knowledge, the education opportunities, and the necessary skills to be the agents of change that this continent of opportunity needs. These endeavors can make Africa the next emerging economy in the next decade or so. Employment is the other pillar in focus today. As with education, employment is a cornerstone upon which many other aspects of our lives rest. On a more macro level, employment opportunities also determine the direction and the progress which a community achieves. Africa has the youngest population in the world, with an estimated 10 to 12 million people joining the labor force each year, an indicator which is projected to increase even further. This huge potential is nonetheless hampered with struggles across the continent to create new productive jobs. In the life of an individual, decent employment often means elevation from poverty and the fulfillment of dreams and aspirations. Decent employment is therefore key for individuals to enjoy their life, their rights, their freedoms, and their human dignity. In African countries, unemployment is nonetheless an issue that is compromising the prospects of our young people there and of their respective communities. The African Development Bank, in fact, notes that in most African countries, youth unemployment is twice than that for adults. Youth unemployment in Africa and elsewhere is a ticking time bomb, as lack of employment opportunities undermine social cohesion, create social tensions, and bring political instability. By contrast, given the right positive conditions and opportunities, young people can be actors of change that can further their communities and their country's well-being. At a communal level, employment opportunities provide a sense of purpose and can bring about prosperity. When decent employment is available, young people entering employment can choose to continue living in their own towns, regions, or respective countries. They are thus not placed in a position where they have to relocate to distant places and countries to make a living. In the African context, the World Bank proposes a job strategy that pays more attention to rural development. The rationale behind this proposal is that investment in agriculture limits youth migration into urban centers. This is of particular importance because young people migrating into these areas aggravate urban unemployment. Furthermore, they face numerous obstacles, including discrimination because of their inexperience. Last year, UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, which I represent as a goodwill ambassador, took part in a regional youth conference in Rwanda, discussing youth employment in agriculture as a means to ending hunger and poverty in Africa. During that event, UNIDO Director General Lee Young stressed the importance of integrating youth in the agricultural sector, particularly in rural areas, to address the challenge of decent and sustainable employment that is coupled with rapid urbanization and work-related migration. Nonetheless, such strategies and endeavors need to be driven by a sustainable approach. If not, solutions will just be temporary and short-term, thus compromising the positions of future generations. Protecting the environment should also be a top priority when devising strategies towards increased employment opportunities. In essence, we need to decouple economic growth from environmental degradation. Economic growth cannot come at the expense of the environment. On the other hand, we need to focus on targets that are achievable. At community level, and on a global scale, we need to endeavor to achieve full employment and decent work for all women and men, including all of our young people. This is, after all, the commitment that the international community has ascribed to in 2015 when it committed itself to the targets outlined in the SDGs to be reached by 2030. In Africa, young women face more difficulties to find employment. The African Development Bank found that in most countries of sub-Saharan Africa and those in North Africa, it is easier for men to secure jobs than women, even if they have the equivalent skills and expertise as men applying for the same job opportunity. These challenges need to be overcome. As progress is achieved, specific challenges will become more pronounced, and gender equality needs always to remain central in our strategies and policies. Another challenge is now also arising in countries who have adopted gender equality strategies. The gender pay gap is now a new challenge to such countries. The global gender pay gap needs to be tackled whilst also pursuing these goals, so as not to discourage further endeavors for equal opportunities. Ignoring the gender pay gap will take decades until women overcome this discrimination. Not only is this another blatant injustice, but actors that continue to perpetuate this discriminatory practice are undermining human dignity and human rights. Humanity must be based on equality, social justice, and respect for human rights. We need to put more pressure on governments, policymakers, regional and global actors to promote development-oriented policies that support decent job creation, quality employment, sustainable entrepreneurship, creativity, and innovation in Africa. It is also essential that our governments encourage small enterprises. Small enterprises, in fact, provide many employment opportunities. Civil society organizations must also be encouraged to venture into social enterprises, as they too can be catalysts for employment opportunities. Furthermore, as committed by the targets set by the SDGs, the international community needs to continue, and even more so, it needs to step up its efforts to eradicate forced labor, child labor, human trafficking, and modern slavery. When reflecting on education and employment, my thoughts always go back to what we as individuals can do to build a world where no one is left behind. In trying to figure this out, my thoughts take me back to my childhood and to my father. My father was a teacher and a headmaster at the school in my village in Malta. Most days of the week, he would encourage and welcome children from difficult and disadvantaged backgrounds to come to our family home, where he would give them one-to-one tuition in academic and other subjects, so that they would better their chances at school. He didn't do this for financial gain or reward, but he did this out of a sense of responsibility, which he always felt for others, and to make sure that those children could become achievers like all the rest. My father believed that each and every one of us has a responsibility towards each other to ensure that social justice truly prevails. Years went by and those children then became adults. Many progressed to become community leaders, business people, and active citizens in our community. Decades later, many would still come and thank my father for the chance he had given them to overcome the inequalities they had suffered. That lesson stayed with me, and I hope it can provide inspiration and direction for us here today. Through my experience since my childhood, I learned that each and every one of us, as members of one human family, has a responsibility towards others. I learned that social justice is not simply a written policy, but it is a lifetime attitude and aspiration. I learned that each and every one of us can be game changers. On the other hand, as an international community, and specifically as Europe, we must effectively reflect on our perceptions, on our outlook, and on our relations with the countries of Africa. We must, as an international community, and specifically as Europeans, move from words to action. I believe we cannot continue to perceive Africa as a continent that creates insurmountable challenges to Europe. I believe that we must stop looking at Africa as the land of migration. I believe we must see ourselves as truly two complementary continents. We need to ask ourselves, have we, as Europeans and as the international community, truly invested sustainably in Africa? Or have we just thrown money at what we perceive as problematic by our standards? Africa does not need charity. Africa needs and deserves proper, sustainable investment. Africa must be looked at as a strategic partner and not as a mammoth problem. Africa has the necessary resources but needs effective, strategic, sustainable partnerships. Africa needs the necessary, genuine assistance to effectively and sustainably develop its full potential. We have a responsibility to help and to provide the necessary support. We have a responsibility to encourage creative thinking, innovation, and foresight to seek partnerships with a wide range of stakeholders. There are many organizations that are endeavoring to bring about the necessary change in the best interests of the African people, such as Beast 55, Global Africa, UNIDO, and the African Union. Africa is a continent of opportunity. Africa has all the key ingredients for success: a young and an enterprising population, rapid urbanization, natural resources, rich ecosystems, and economies full of potential. Africa is, and will even more be, a player that needs to be given its rightful dignity and more appreciation in the international community. As described by President Juncker, Africa must be our equal partner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I'd like to ask all the panelists to please join us on stage. Please, Minister, others, all panelists, come and take your spot here. As they make their way to the stage, the President did an excellent job laying out the challenges and opportunities before us. I just want to give you one statistic that maybe can help to frame the scale of the challenge. There are 75 million young people in the world today who are unemployed. 75 million. 38 million of them are in Africa. We all know the statistics about population growth, and we heard in those excellent remarks the scale of the challenge that we have before us on education, on entrepreneurship, on employment. So we want to get right into a conversation that's dynamic with this group and that will hopefully include many of you as well. And I want to begin with someone who has kind of seen everything in the development sector, I think. You worked at the Gates Foundation, you've been a governor, an alternate governor at the African Development Bank, the World Bank, the IMF, so you've seen this world. And now as a minister in Senegal, working on youth unemployment, entrepreneurship, running a $50 million fund for that purpose. Minister Papa Amadou Sarr, you're the general delegate for entrepreneurship in Senegal. Can you give us big picture, your take on this? Should we be depressed by these massive challenges that we've just heard about on everything from education to employment, or is there a path forward?
So, thank you so much. And before I start, I would like to thank the European Union Commission for inviting me to attend these European Development Days. My head of state, President Macky Sall, was here yesterday, and he mentioned some of these challenges. And please also allow me to thank the former president of Malta for her introductory remarks, which resonates a lot for me in my country. I would just pick up a couple of issues to mention. The fact that Africa and Europe has a common ambition and common future in solving the jobs issues for youth. She said it rightly, the challenges of migration that are fearing Europe. Countries like Italy, Spain, Malta, France, and all other countries are trying to put together policies that constrain some migrants, including clandestine migrants, to come into Europe, but they have not succeeded so far. We've worked on that when I was at the OECD in Paris to try to put together regulation and policies that allow circular migration, allow mobility between the two continents, to allow talent to go between. And then some of the people like me who studied abroad in France, UK, in the US, are back now in the country, come back and forth. If you have visas and resident cards that allow that mobility, that will help a lot. And I think Juncker mentioned it yesterday, thinks we should go for that path. One other thing she mentioned about the opportunity of Africa, we're going to be around 2 billion people in the next 20 to 30 years. These are unique opportunities. Some are talking about challenges, fears. I don't see it as such, because for me, you have a vibrant youth, increasingly well-trained, and then that have the capacity to transform the economies of the continent. And then we have a growing middle class, let alone Nigeria, South Africa, Western Africa, and Southern Africa. These are opportunities for big multinationals that will invest and make impact and create jobs for youth on the continent.
So there's a big investment opportunity there. We're going to talk with a private sector representative in a moment about that kind of opportunity and the scale of it. In a way, you're swimming against the tide a little bit, talking about visas and labor mobility the way you are. I'm glad you are. I want to go to someone else who's, in a way, swimming against the tide. That's Arantxa Gonzalez, who's the executive director of the International Trade Center. You spent your whole career working on trade. Little did you know it was going to become such an exciting environment for someone who believes in trade. It is not a boring time to be doing what you're doing. How do you see trade as a piece of this conversation about how we get to a more constructive place on investment in Africa's education and future workforce?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's true that trade is back, is popular again, not necessarily for the right reasons, but never mind. Let's take the opportunity to focus a bit of attention on trade and why it matters to this conversation about jobs. More importantly, why it matters for the conversation about quality jobs. Trade is a conveyor belt of competitiveness. And competitiveness is what allows us to get better salaries, better working conditions, better functioning economies. And this is why I like the putting together the trade and the jobs. Yep. And doing this in the African continent obviously requires that we look at the continental free trade agreement that Africa has embarked on, that President Macky Sall, that President Paul Kagame, that were here yesterday, are investing so much political capital into, because this, if implemented, or rather when implemented, can be a big game changer.
And for those who aren't familiar, this is about trade within the continent, country to country, which is a huge challenge today.
That's right. Because many traders would start with the neighboring country. They would not immediately think of exporting to Europe. Their first experience is going to be with the next-door neighbor. Continental Free Trade Agreement is about integrating the African continent, which at the moment is extremely fragmented. Three things I would say that matter, that we have to bring together in this conversation. First is to link the small and medium enterprises, many of which are in the informal sector in Africa. Women, 70% informal sector, underleveraged. For them, the Continental Free Trade Agreement is a big opportunity because it reduces barriers to entry, which is what is pushing them to the informal sector. Number two is thinking about building the right ecosystems. And building the ecosystems requires thinking about skills. And thinking about skills requires matching skills with what the market is demanding. What we see across the African continent, not just, but since this is big focus Africa, is a big skills mismatch.
You're previewing what Marie Chantal is about to tell us about in a moment. Keep going,
so
though.
I'll
Keep
close
going.
there, but I want to put skills mismatch with digital. Because more and more the jobs require a big digital content. So the rest over to you, Marie-Chantal.
Well, I'm going to come back over here since you mentioned digital. So we've heard some big picture ideas already. big picture ideas on labor mobility, on trade. The next one I want to go to is on industrialization. UNIDO, the UN's Industrial Development Organization, has been around a long time. Philippe Schultz is the managing director of program development and technical cooperation there. You spent your whole career at UNIDO. You've looked at these issues for a long time. Industrialization has changed a lot. It's now digital. We're now thinking high tech. Things are shifting a lot. When you think about the African context, what does industrialization mean for the challenges that we heard from the former president?
Well, thank you again for being part of this, inviting us to do that. And I would like to come back to the inspiring remarks of the former president of Malta. And it's true that, and it's probably not a coincidence that it is in Valletta, in her home country, that the whole idea of linking somehow stability, security, and the migration solution in the EU was linked explicitly to development potential in sub-Saharan Africa in particular. And we see that industry is actually an employment vehicle. It's an employment vector in both directly, that is the jobs that are secured in the small and medium-sized companies that Arantxa was referring to, but also indirectly by raising the income of a part of population, the kind of 200-300 million and growing middle class in Africa that has purchasing power, disposable income that in itself creates jobs also for further. But what we feel is that we have to work, of course, on industrial expansion, but in a way that is inclusive from a viewpoint of providing opportunities to underprivileged segments of the society, whether it is the rural population, and where you still have today 70% of the poor living off of incomes that derive one way or the other from agriculture, and whether it be the youth, whether it be women and so on. And we are targeting our efforts in these particular categories of the population and see how we can raise their employability, raise their skills in different ways. We recently consolidated at UNIDO all the resources that we had in this way that used to be fragmented across the organization, but we brought them under one roof, and that includes, for instance, curriculum development, so where we work with kids typically at grade 8, 9, 10 or so, young children. I might sound a bit early for them to expose them to entrepreneurship and so on, but again, we have to realize that for many that's about as far as they will be in terms of formal education, so that is about curriculum development. And with this, we reach out to quite a large segment of the population across the continent. Second is that entrepreneurship development program, so that is incubation, typically services, training services that are aimed at entrepreneurs. And the third one that is increasingly important and where we see a very strong interest on the part of the private sector is technical vocational education and training, where we engage more and more with private companies in this part of the world, in OECD region, and basically an alignment of interest between their commercial goals as private entities, looking for market share, looking for profitability, whatever that may be, and at the same time alignment with our development goals. And we're running a number of vocational training programs across Africa, basically to raise the skills of the workforce and raise the employability. And the last point that I would like to make is, again, coming back to what Arantxa mentioned, the digital economy and how we can prepare and see education and training as a means of preparing the youth and the workforce there to make such that the new industrial revolution, as far as UNIDO is concerned, doesn't result in widening the digital divide, but on the contrary, that represents opportunities and that can be captured and exploited by the local populations for accelerated growth and leapfrogging in some cases. So
it's interesting to me that coming from UNIDO, all the examples you gave are really about education and training. Right? When I think of industrialization, I don't necessarily think about education and training as the key linchpin, but it's clear from your remarks that that is the case. And I want to stay on that theme and come to Marie-Chantal Uitonze, who's the CEO of Bees 55, which is an organization that focuses exactly on these issues on the continent of Africa. You're Rwandan yourself. You're working on training and education across the workforce. Give us a better sense of what you're doing at Bees 55 and what you see on the ground. Welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, and I'm very happy that the previous speakers have already raised some of the challenges. We are trying to address the skills mismatch between what university, schools, and vocational training institutions are providing and align it to what the market needs. We are doing it by the means of incubation programs, but we also are partnering with some schools of polytechnics, some institutions, some companies to help us to actually try to get a sense of their needs. And we are starting a project very soon, which is a research laboratory that will focus on finding the skills gap.
Can you give us an example? Like, where are people being trained today that doesn't make sense, that doesn't match the job opportunities that exist?
We talked about industrialization. Industrialization is about engineering. It's about mechanical skills. In Africa, most of the people are trained in social sciences and human sciences. What we need people who can work with a machine. We need digital skills, of course. We need people who can build the infrastructure. And we are really trying to focus on the labor-intensive sectors that are a big niche for employment, but also that are needed for the stage where Africa is in terms of development. So another thing that is very important is that there is a category of sectors that are stigmatized or that are disregarded with young people, due to the policy that are adopted at the national level. We're trying also to lobby with institutions so that they also can promote some of the sectors like agriculture. In Africa, many people think that agriculture is only farming, and young people don't think that they are valorized when they have agriculture backgrounds. We're trying to show what is possible and what are all the opportunities in the whole value chain. Others are in the creative industries, which has lots of potential both in terms of trade and industrialization. But this is also neglected by the policy. So we're trying to see how we can work with institutions, both public and private, companies, educational institutions, to build an international network for skills development and skills matching.
I'll just give another quick example from Rwanda. Another social enterprise that's shaking things up. Are people familiar with Zipline? Anybody know Zipline?
Yes.
Nobody, very few.
Yes, of course.
Here on stage, but I'm not seeing a lot of faces out there. A couple of hands. They are technically, in Silicon Valley terms now, called a unicorn, which means they're valued at over $1 billion. A small Rwandan-based startup, which has designed drones to deliver blood. And I went to Rwanda recently, and I saw them in action, and there's a Rwandan team who are developing and building the drones, designing, launching. It's really a domestic organization that is now going global. They're going to Ghana, they're going to the United States. So there's opportunities in these kinds of sectors that may not be, to your point, traditionally trained for. Yeah. Let's keep the conversation moving. I want to bring in Untitled Chapter from Zambia. We were talking about this earlier because you work on very similar issues. You started your own nonprofit social enterprise. You're helping to train people in the world of entrepreneurship. What is the gap you see? It's a little bit different than what we've heard so far. What's the gap that you're seeing?
Well, two things. I'll talk about both entrepreneurship and education. Now, in sub-Saharan Africa, we need to create 18 million jobs every year until 2030 in order to fill up the unemployment gap. Now, we see SMEs as having the potential to contribute towards creating these new jobs. We know the European Commission has created programs to help entrepreneurs access finance, but that in itself is not enough. I'll give you an example. One of our entrepreneurs bootstrapped to start her little bakery, and she was doing everything on her own. And she comes to us and says, I'm getting overwhelmed because I'm getting too many orders, I have to deal with deliveries and everything like that, and she's not paying attention to quality and marketing more, and she's basically frustrated and she wants to stop. But we're looking at that as an opportunity now to scale up our enterprise. Now, there are a lot of people who, just like her, don't have the skill set or they don't have the technical assistance in order to scale up their enterprise. So it's access to markets, it's mentorship for entrepreneurs, it's quality assurance, it's creating a product that will be widely accepted in the market. Those are the sort of things that entrepreneurs need, and that's lacking.
So too many entrepreneurs get stuck at that micro level, and they can never get to be even a small business and a medium business.
Exactly. And for somebody like her, all she needed was to get somebody to run her business full-time, a part-time person to do deliveries, and that would be 2 jobs created already, you see, in an already existing business. And also, when we look at the SME sector in Africa, in the country that I come from, in Zambia, we're looking at it employing about 90% of the labor force. So the SMEs take up a lot of the people in the job market. Now, one of the problems that's there is also the skills that we are creating might not be, might not match what the SMEs need now, and even worse in future, because the nature of the job market is changing, the nature of work is changing. I'll give you a practical example. When I was in junior high school, I learned a course called office practice. And as it sounds, it should be a course that teaches you office skills, but it was a very theoretical course. You list down what is the functions of a computer, what is the functions of a stapler, what is the functions of a perforator, and all those things that are not exactly necessary for the job market. Can we teach things that are more practical, you know? So it's also about creating reforms around the education system. So what is taught in school is actually what the market needs.
Yeah, we're going to hear about that now, I think, exactly on that point. Very practical skills from Marita Mitchain, who's the Vice President and Managing Director of Digital Skills at SAP, the huge software company. And you manage Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, 22 countries you're working on digital skills. Yes. It's in direct contrast maybe to the junior high school experience we just heard. What are you training young people on?
Yes, so as we know, Africa and the Middle East have one of the highest youth unemployment rates or youth underemployment rates in the world. And then, of course, you can look at it as the glass half full or the glass half empty. So I saw it as a great opportunity, having, and I call it abundance of youth, and actually very well-educated youth. And so SAP has a slogan, improve people's life, and I say one life at a time. And so what we have done, we have created a program which takes the unemployed youth, sends them through a boot camp, and then finds them a job in the bigger SAP ecosystem. This is, I would say, the one life at a time improvement. Mm-hmm. And just to give you a few numbers, we are doing this only since 2013. And by now we have created over 2,200 jobs. Don't forget, each and every of these persons has been underemployed before, and they are now fully employed in a well-paid job. And the beauty of this is that this well-paid job is not only for them. They will impact their families, they will impact their friends. So we found out that pretty much every person we get into this kind of employment will support other 40 family members or influence them. There's this example of Atenkosi. He is from South Africa, from one of the townships, really the poorest of the poor that you can imagine. He did go through this program. He now has a job. He was able to move his mother out of the township, buy her a decent house, and pay for the education of his siblings. This is just one out of 2,200 success stories where it really impacted the life of the people. Of course, there are other things like Africa Code Weeks, where we touch 2.3 million young people learning how to code. But if I look at real outcome, I see that taking one person at a time and really getting them into the ecosystem and into the job can really create much more than you see on face value.
Let me just ask all of you here on that end of the panel, and I want to bring our new panelists in as well, but on this point, what would you say to critics? Because we're here in Brussels, and the European Commission, people are thinking big, huge programs that reach millions of people, and I gave you the statistics about how grand the challenge is. You're all talking about kind of solutions that target one individual entrepreneur, one person learning digital skills. and growing from there. What's your argument to people who might say this is too small?
So as I mentioned, we do both. If you want to touch millions of people, you pretty much have to take, I call it a water can, and distribute it a little bit, because you just will not have the funds to give hundreds of millions of people the deep education that they would need. So yes, we come from both ends and touch both. But if I really want to change the ecosystem and to want to grow it, I have to look at the catalysts that can help with the change. And just so you know, these 2,200, we have 100% placement rate. Just because of the abundance of use, we can pick the ones that will make this change in their ecosystem and in their country.
They get certified in SAP, and companies need them. There's demand for those jobs.
Exactly. But if you go back, what we noticed as well, and I would like to come back to Her Excellency in the introductory speech, is the education. I think we already fail in our base education. How many of the kids who have finished their high school really know how to read a P&L? How many of them know the difference between income and profit? Mm-hmm. It's just we are failing here in a big time. And if you look into the skills that were used in the last century compared to what we will need in the next thing, we need problem-solving skills, we need complex solution skills, and we need creativity. And actually what we have done in the schools is pretty much take the creativity out. We're concentrating on STEM. So I always say, let's go back to STEAM, put A for art into this equation.
Science, technology, engineering, arts, math.
Math, exactly, because then we have a chance, again, to have talent that can solve problems, real-life problems. So if you look into our 3 months training, it's 50% soft skills, including, you call it creativity training, and it's only 50% really in the tech environment that we need for SAP. And these 50% soft skills, I would say, get the youth ready for the future and enable them to create their own companies, where we have the first examples of. So we have to rethink, and with a 67% internet penetration in the world, even in Africa, we have to look into alternatives instead of bringing kids to the classroom. Right. There is a very nice initiative, it's called Academy, from Awe, oh wow, how great is this, that has a completely different approach to teaching and is available for free for everybody who has internet access.
Yeah, one of the
my
things
few thoughts on where we are going in the future.
One of the things we're very often doing in the development sector is looking at what happened before or what exists today. But one of the things I point out in my book is we are very close, when I talk to telecom executives, just a few years away from ubiquitous internet, high broadband, wearable devices, smartphones in every hand, and we're getting to the point where it can be cheap enough to actually do many of the things you were just describing. I want to bring in our last discussant here, Carol Camejo, who is a vice president of SES, also has worked in the satellite sector across Africa. You won the award, Business Daily, a top 40 under 40 woman in business. What is your take on this conversation of how we bridge this gap on education and employment in Africa?
All right, thank you very much. So one of the key things, and as I was listening to you, I was nodding excitedly because it's the same thing that we see. And to your last comment that we are getting into this age where everything and everyone is connected. So the question is, who's going to do the connecting? You know, we need to create those skill sets. And that's the space that we are addressing today. So SES as a company is a satellite provider. We provide managed services across the globe. In Africa specifically, we have thousands of sites that we've installed. What we've done is create a program called the Elevate program. We've gone out to the market, gotten some kids who are from school or university, or maybe your third year, fourth year, or you finished university, you've been doing some odd jobs of installing, you know, trying to create employment for yourself. We meet you at that point, run a 2-day program. We focus on the technical skills. How do we install a VSAT? How do you use a spectrum analyzer? How do you do all these things? But 70% of our time is spent on equipping So we talk about business plans. We give you a template to go create your own business
So
cards.
some of the same basic skills Marita was talking about.
Exactly. So we equip beyond just saying this is a good technical workshop, but how do we turn that technical workshop into an employment opportunity? So I see what we do with Elevate as an opportunity to create employment. Since 2015, we've trained 8,000 trainers across Africa in 10 African countries. The way we address the issue around scaling is we have a trainer for trainer program. So if you're trained, we take the top 20 in the class and we equip them to go and train another 20 or another 40.
And do they get a certification?
Yes.
Like an SAP certification?
They get a certification, there's an examination, and then at the end of the training session, we give them a small bag which has a dust coat, has some basic tools that you need, a USB stick that has all the templates for your business card and your very simple business plan. There are a lot of soft skills that we invest time in, so teaching them how do you approach a customer, how do you have a conversation. And we've seen that it dignifies a lot of these, what is considered odd jobs, by giving it a structure and empowering the young people and also giving them the esteem to go and do even more. So we've had examples of young people who've come to us saying that has been transformational, it has been relatable, it has been relevant, it has been within their scope, and that's what we need, because we cannot change everything overnight, but we can, each of us, do what we're doing and contribute in our different ways.
So I want to get everyone into this discussion. I'm going to be reaching out to all of you for your interventions in a second. But Minister, you've now just heard from lots of people who are doing some pretty exciting things on the ground, training people, working with entrepreneurs. From your perspective, where you sit, this is your portfolio in Senegal, is to get more people trained up to create more employment and young entrepreneurs. What do you want to see the private sector do more of? What could the institutions that are represented here do in a way that will help drive this agenda faster and further?
Let me come back quickly to some of the points SES and SAP made, which are issues my government faced, I would say, over the last 10 years in terms of skills mismatch. And then, as Marie Chantal said it, the trainings that are more focused on social sciences. When President Macky Sall came to power in 2012, one of the things he did is to focus on vocational professional training and also into the programs, putting a lot of things related to mathematics, science and technology, and also providing access to technologies, providing internet access easily, fiber, to all the universities and training centers to allow those young students to be able to access to labor markets. At the end of the day, that's a key challenge. Now I'm speaking as a policymaker, in the sense that if you look at the government itself, it creates only 200,000 jobs for 15 million inhabitants. Among them, more than 60% of the population is young, less than 25 years old. And every year you have around 100,000 students that come out of the university that need a job. This is Senegal. Don't talk about Nigeria, Kenya, big countries. You see the challenges. That's why we're focusing on building partnerships with key players like the MasterCard Foundation. We have an agreement with them of $200 million for the 30 million jobs for youth in Africa over the next 5 years. And the objective is basically to train the kids to have the right sets of skills that allow them to enter the job market, but also create their own business. That's why the president created last year this entity called the Rapid Delegation for Rapid Entrepreneurship for Youth and Women. It seemed a bit weird when they created it from the international community. They saw it was a political institution to distribute resources. And then what we did with 100 people, young engineers, entrepreneurs, economists, statisticians, we put together a strategy that allow us, we worked with Dalberg, that allow us to fund entrepreneurs, debt, equity, guarantee, in order to help them create business or strengthen business.
So almost like a little venture capital fund within the government.
Exactly. But the return on investment is not that high. It's 5% maximum interest rate. The objective is to create talent, to allow those young kids and entrepreneurs to have access to finance. Because as the Zambian lady was saying earlier on, you have a lot of talent on the continent. But what is missing is cash. I've been Director General of the Ministry of Finance for a year, and then I've worked with the banks and the microfinance institutions and the insurance companies, but they don't lend to the youth. They don't lend to the female entrepreneurs because the risk is high. So what we did is we focus on youth, age 18 to 40, and women without the limit of age to give them access to capital, coaching, guarantee, formalization, and as the lady in red was saying, help them formalize, have access to banking system. We opened up around 80,000 bank accounts in a year. And these, for the first year, with $50 million, we've been able to impact 180,000 people. And we're working with the AFTB and MasterCard Foundation, as I was mentioning earlier, to go at the next level. And I will finish on the digital side. One of the key aspects of our strategy is to use technologies to be able to access the maximum of people. People will apply online, we pay online, we monitor online, we use mobile banking to pay and recover. And then we're also creating what we call the Dakar Innovation Hub, which will be an incubation and acceleration center that allow those young kids, startups that are in the IoT, blockchain, artificial intelligence sector to have access to financing and develop talents. I'm talking to one of your contractors in Dakar called Khalija, SAP. We're seeing how we work together in Microsoft to develop and boost that entrepreneurship skill set.
You know, one thing I take away from what you're saying and what others have said is there's a mismatch, maybe, in the development sector, right? This is a $200 billion aid industry, but there's very little for education.
Exactly.
Education is a tiny component. And when you talk to people why, you know, we've interviewed at DevX lots of people who cover the sector and say, we wish we were global health. You know, global health seems to have a better argument and get more funding. Global education, there's new funding instruments out there, but they're pretty small comparatively. And all of you have talked about education and training as a key component. You're talking about the MasterCard Foundation. There's a lot of interest in digital jobs and youth skilling, but the funding still isn't that significant. And then financing for entrepreneurs, still a huge gap. Why do we have this? Do people see it this way? Am I summarizing correctly? And why does that gap exist? Anyone who wants to take it.
If I may, one point on that. In my former job before joining the government, I worked for the biggest foundation in the world, the Gates Foundation. The strategies was pretty much focused on health and agriculture, funding new tools, deliveries, finding new drugs, and new products that alleviate and increase health care. And one of the things I used to say to Bill Gates or Melinda Gates' wife is, look, I think you're missing something. There are millions of jobs. There are millions of young people in Africa, in India, in Europe, in Asia that need training, skills, and create jobs, and that will allow to improve the health conditions. They come into it, some are coming, but the health sector and poverty and SDGs sells more than education. But I think it's a mistake.
Well, maybe they're taking your advice. As you might know, they're starting to get into the global education game. Other thoughts, Arantxa?
I think there is two misconceptions. Misconception number one is that you don't invest on the economy because the economy takes care of itself. You invest on all the other softer stuff. Whereas the economy is not taking care of itself, and financing is a good example. The financial markets in Africa are not working for the small entrepreneurs. They're working to make money. Now, and to keep your money safe, but it's not for the money that you can generate in the future. Second misconception is that you can solve the problem of unemployment but just simply focusing on access to finance, credit and capital. It is not enough. You have two other ingredients before and after. One is the entrepreneurial skills, and the other one is the market. So if it's not enough to open a line of credit that will facilitate access to credit and capital for the small entrepreneur, this person has to be a professional in the business. Entrepreneurship is a profession, it's not just a hobby, and it has to have a market, meaning a place to which it will sell the products and the services. And that this is where you have to look at it holistically. 2 points, if I may. On education, I think the biggest challenge we have is that we have to learn. And we are focusing on transferring knowledge. Whereas what we have to learn is how are we going to learn? Because we're going to have to change our knowledge several times in our lifetime. And the second point is on skills mismatch, don't wait until you discover you have a mismatch. Do this ex ante. We've done this in the Gambia with amazing results. Universities are turning chartered accountants, engineers, lawyers, lots of lawyers. What is the market demanding? Not a single repair of phones in the Gambia. So my phone breaks, I have to send it to Dakar. No way to get it fixed in the Gambia, in Banjul.
But if you want to sue the phone maker, there are a lot of lawyers you can go to.
Exactly. But, you don't want to sue. You don't want to sue the phone maker. You want to have your phone repaired. So, match this. We've done a huge mapping of the skills needed and the skills available, and it's a great tool that the now government and private sector and the youth can use to direct a bit of resources and a bit of effort.
And it's impressive when you think about just one thing to underline from SAP's comments, the idea that this is just a 3-month training. We're not talking about the equivalent of a chartered accountant or a lawyer. These are very short-term trainings. I know, Marie-Chantal, you had some thoughts about this.
Yeah, I just want to complement what Arencha has said. It is true that there is also some areas where it is not only about training, it's not only about employment, it's also about investment. Yeah. So one of the challenges in Africa is that economies are not well developed, some value chains are not developed at the level that you can grow further. I give an example, which is Senegal, that I know very well as well as my country, Rwanda. Senegal have got like 300 association of tailors, but they're all basic tailors. They know how to craft your skirt, but do they have skills to go further? Is there any industry that transforms the raw material? So there is a whole value chain that is not invested in, which means that you're not also going to create more jobs because you don't have what it needs. You don't have the enabling environment. And that is why also we are also trying to build a partnership with UNIDO so that the industrial agenda match also the skills development and sensitize the government for investment, which is very important.
And maybe matches the trade agenda so we can get those amazing Senegalese clothes everywhere that people want them. I know others in the panel want to jump in, but I want to see, are there thoughts here? We have one in the front row, if somebody can bring a mic around. Provocative questions. Are we missing anything? There's something you're saying, how are they not talking about this question or this issue? We've got two here in the front.
Yeah, my name is Christine Larquin from SES. I just wanted to jump on one remark that the minister said. You mentioned that youth and women, entrepreneurs, had difficulties to borrow. And I wanted to just refer to discussions I had with a service provider in Kenya. And he was saying to me, when we give a smartphone and money to women, to look and connectivity to women for agriculture, they make a business out of it. Much more than the men. Yep. So I think that we should change a paradigm and we should give more money to women because I'm pretty sure that by doing this, you will create more jobs.
Thank you for that. And we're going to take one more thought behind you if we can.
Hi, I'm Sarah Aldridge from the Cooperative College in Manchester. I just want to question really about the cooperative economy or the collective economy and collective entrepreneurship. Where's the role for that? And also, where's the role for the green economy, just in the face of climate change?
Thank you for both those. Were there any others? I'll take one back on this end.
Hi, I'm Tatiana from Mozambique. I run a social enterprise to promote entrepreneurship and innovation. And only last year, we trained 1,200 entrepreneurs, youth and women, and supported 200 businesses. One of the things that I hear a lot, and I'm glad that this panel had different sectors, is people are not actually focusing on understanding ecosystem and looking at ecosystems at the local development level, and how can that actually promote the as you were saying, support to entrepreneurs, but then also links to market, and how does this drive economy? And I also feel that there's been a lot of mismatch in terms of what we are teaching. A lot of what has been teaching, if we insist that entrepreneurs and to teach entrepreneurship is to teach a business plan, we're actually teaching the wrong things. We must focus more on creativity. Business plans are actually a myth. There's no actual entrepreneur who started a business with a business plan. You need a business plan further on your life cycle when you need to get funding. And as you start up, especially in Africa, you won't get that money. You need to be very creative on how to do that. So we must rethink the way we are approaching those challenges. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Philippe, I wonder if I can go to you, because it seems to me, just picking up on the 3 interventions we've just had and everything we're hearing, if I had to pick one word for this session, maybe it's integration. Mm-hmm. Everyone is talking about how we need to be integrated in the way people are trained up to become an entrepreneur, to get the creative skills, to get the technical skills, to get the financing, to have a market opportunity. It's this linkage idea to be able to trade with other countries. How do you see this from your perspective, and help us tie the conversation together?
Well, I want to make 2 points here. One is in relation to this, what we heard on mismatch, on skill mismatch, and to say that however appealing a concept it is, it can be dangerous if it is left alone. And I happen to be working in a European research project for a few years here, and we were connecting with all research centers and academia across the European Union. And the idea that was econometric research, so we were developing a model that highlighted the causes of unemployment, and different causes should call to completely different policy prescriptions, including on the part of the ODA community like ourselves. So basically, in a nutshell, you have 3 curves. One is the labor supply. That is, you have a country with X million people. Not all of them are in the labor market. You have the youth, you have the elderly, so you have some who simply don't want to be part of the labor market, so you define your labor supply accordingly. Then you have 2 curves that are important. One is the classical employment. That is, the volume of employment that can be created given the capital stock in place in the country. And the second curve is the Canadian demand. That means the number of jobs that can be warranted given the demand for goods and services in the country. These 3 curves over time intersect with one another, but the policy response must be entirely different. What we are focusing on here is the classical unemployment. It means simply not enough machines around for people to go around. And the solution, the policy solution in that case, is to boost investment, lower interest rate, somehow encourage entrepreneurship and so on. This is what we seem to have focused on, but the other one is equally important, and particularly for developing countries, the Keynesian unemployment, which arises when you simply don't have enough demand for your goods and services to employ all your population, all the labor supply. So that curve falls behind the labor supply. And in that case, the policy prescription is completely different. That's a matter of revamping demand, and the job that ITC does, for instance, to facilitate exports and international trade by expanding markets in itself is a response to this. That's one point. The second point, very quickly, is that there was last year a couple of very important events that were, one of them was the launch of the International Solar Alliance in New Delhi in India. Both of them were somehow of interest to us at UNIDO, the International Solar Alliance, so the idea that 130 countries in the tropical bands would get together to boost solar energy. And the other one was an event in Abuja, Nigeria, with Afreximbank soon after the launch of the African Continental Free Trade Area. And it was amazing to see that there were a number of high-level dignitaries in these 2 events, many heads of states, heads of government across the African continent, and how quickly the debate was shifting from, yes, solar energy is well and nice, we are all for it, but we look at it because it can somehow power enterprises, and these enterprises can create jobs. And when you talk of the African Continental Free Trade Area, every speech that was given there in Abuja came to the same conclusion. Yes, trade is good, but we don't want to go on trading commodities and raw materials. We want to trade processed goods, and that will create enterprises, that will create jobs. So from the viewpoint of policymaker, the number one item on their agenda is jobs and employability. So if we look at it, again, coming back to the first argument on the sources of unemployment, I think it's very important not to be too focused also on the existing industries and to say that there's a skill mismatch, we need more accountants or we need more electrical engineers there, because this is
you need an industrial strategy. Where are we headed?
You need to think of where the demand will be, and in the renewable energy space, for instance, there's an enormous creation of jobs there that were not thinkable 10 years ago, simply because today we see, and Germany actually has done an extensive study on this to demonstrate how much the renewable energy space is in itself an employment generation activity. So we have to rethink somehow the employment phenomenon and not focus too much, or exclusively at least, on the skill mismatch. That's
right, exactly. We've got to be able to look out to what's coming, and we heard about, and I think you're right, Sarah, we didn't get into the green and climate issues on this panel much. You've just begun to. Are there other things that we think we may be missing? I haven't heard anyone talk about the gig economy, for example, and how we're shifting in that direction. Talk about classical employment. That's certainly typical jobs may not be the way we think about this in the future.
But the gig economy is the self-employed, which is, as the minister said, the only area that can grow. The public sector jobs are not going to grow. On the contrary, with e-government, probably they're going to shrink. The only part of the market that can grow is self-employment. And this is where the gig economy has a role to play. Now, there is a different discussion to be had, which is what kind of gig economy do we want in our societies?
What protections do we want for workers in that situation?
What rules of the game?
Go ahead.
Yes, I would just to reflect on the lady who talked about entrepreneurial skills out of the auditorium.
Tatiana, yeah.
Yes, a business plan doesn't make a business. So this is why if you look at the skills of the future, and I would like to come back to this, complex problem-solving skills, critical thinking, and creativity. And actually, these are three elements that I think an entrepreneur in today's world has to have. And I would add as well cognitive agility, because the world will change, and before his first product is out, the demand has changed. And it's customer centricity. So please have a look at what is a new initiative called Winnovate. It's a play from winning on innovation, so it's Winnovate. And it's definitely for entrepreneurs. It's in design thinking combined with business model canvas and positive psychology. I think if you get these straight, you can create a business. So I haven't talked about this because this is the new kid on the block being rolled out, tested in Middle East now, coming to Africa, inshallah, very soon.
You know, one of the topics that was brought up by somebody in the audience here, by Christine, was the idea of women entrepreneurs. Haven't gotten to that too much. You yourself are a woman entrepreneur, and you, I assume, work with a lot. What's your take on that question? How can people like the minister and others who have the ability to invest take gender equality into account as they plan their approach here?
I'll start by commenting on Arache's statement. She said entrepreneurship is a profession. And back home in Africa, because of unemployment, people look at entrepreneurship as a means of sustenance. And I think when people do that, we sort of get it wrong. Not everybody is meant to be an entrepreneur. And something also don't talk about is the fact that we don't have big businesses in Africa. We don't have multinationals, so we could have a few. So the mindset of us starting small and growing into a big enterprise is just not something that is talked about. We look at entrepreneurship as my bread and butter for today, but this is a conversation that needs to start. We need to start mindset transformation as well. But when we say mindset transformation and talking about businesses, we're not saying everybody should be a business person. But if I'm operating in a business, I should also have the vision of the leader, of the entrepreneur, and I want to work towards growing it into a big enterprise.
Marie-Chantal, I want you to close us out, and on this point, because I was struck looking at Bees 55 and the work that you're doing, that you're working with entrepreneurs, but you're also thinking about just employees and workers across the economy, in agriculture, in construction, and manufacturing, And we've naturally gone a lot to entrepreneurship because that is an engine of creating new jobs. But give us a slightly broader picture about what does the workforce of the future in Africa look like? What are you training for today?
I do think that, as you have highlighted the profile of partners, the workforce of Africa will not resemble any workforce in the world. It will resemble Africa. And one of the mistake Africa has done for a long time is to import ecosystem, to import models of training, of creating jobs, of investing. Africa needs to connect to itself and adapt investment policies and everything to the needs of the population and social context. And I want, again, to complement what I said. It is not only about training and education. It's about investment. I insist on this because Africa, for instance, in agriculture, is importing $35 billion on food importation, while we have the most biggest arable lands that are not invested in. We have the youngest population, but are we helping those to connect to what their countries are good for? So it's very important to have this policy coherence in all segments of the politics, not only in education, not only in job creation. And I want also to say it's about cooperation. That's why Biz 55 is a network, because I think no one can do the job itself. That's why we have all this profile on the stage, and all of us are complementary in what we're doing. And this has to be beyond talking. We need to talk the walk and to walk the talk, sorry.
I'm glad you're closing us out on this point of opportunity.
Yeah.
Because I do think that often on this topic of workforce and employment, we get a message of fear, especially here in Europe, a message of fear about migration, about a continent in the wrong direction. And I think it is important to think about investment and opportunities. We've heard from so many of you. When we started DevX 19 years ago, it was right when the internet boom and bubble, it was the year 2000, and I wrongly thought at that time we were going to see all this disruption in our sector, places like UN agencies and others. And really, we didn't see that. Things kind of kept moving in the direction it was moving, and with some slow, iterative change. But I think right now is a moment of tremendous disruption in the work that all of us are doing, whether it's the new technology, the new financing, the new money, the new approaches that we've heard about today. So I hope you leave the session with a sense of optimism for what is possible. So please join me in thanking this fantastic panel, and thanks to all of you for being a part of it today.